All right, welcome back, everyone. It's our pleasure to bring Paul Biondi up on stage to be talking about partnering for innovation. Paul is the general partner for Flagship Pioneering, as well as the president for Pioneering Medicines.
Well, thanks, everyone. Really excited to be here today. Just for those of you who don't know me and my background, so I've been at Flagship now for about 5 years. And I came in both as, just mentioned, as a general partner, so I help sit on the boards and oversee many of the companies in the Flagship ecosystem. But in addition to that, I built a unit called Pioneering Medicines, which I'll talk a little bit about, which is basically focused on trying to leverage the platforms that are within that we've developed at Flagship, and trying to make sure we can do essentially more programs on those platforms. And I'll talk a little bit about that model. But today I wanted to prior to that, I was at Bristol Myers Squibb. Many of my former colleagues are actually in the audience, which is great. And Robert and I will get up a little bit later to talk to you. But in that role, I was there for about 17 years. 5 of those years, I ran the business development and strategy function. And then prior to that, I was on the R&D side doing kind of portfolio strategy, operations, and the general chief of staff to 2 heads of R&D. So excited to share with you because also in my role at Flagship, I spent a lot of time thinking about novel ways in which companies can partner, and I'll hit on some of that. So what I wanted to do is just go through and give you, just some sense of kind of some dynamics that I see in the market. The one thing I wanted to start on this slide, which was, I think there was a time, even when I was at BMS, we had an explicit strategy when I was there under Elliot Siegel and with Lamberto Andreotti and Jim Cornelius of saying, hey, we're gonna do 50% of our innovation internally and 50% of our innovation on the outside. And that was sort of a recognition of hey, there was a lot of things kind of bubbling up in the biotech sector. I would say that at that time was kind of a choice. At this point, it's sort of an imperative. On both sides. So on the pharma side, there's just so much innovation that is happening in the exterior environment, fueled by so many insights that are happening that I'll talk to a little bit. It's just impossible not to be looking on the outside and actually having that as a core part of your strategy. So there's a necessity from their perspective if they're going to be innovative and stay ahead and not be disrupted. You saw this in the vaccine market with the mRNAs, for those that were the vaccine players, that was hugely disruptive. On the other side, obviously for biotech companies, I also think that for a while there, and maybe even in the immediate past when we had 0 interest rates and, partnering was seen as, in everybody's strategy, which is, well, yeah, sure, it's always a good thing to try to partner, but it's not necessarily a necessity. Again, I think that's really changed. And in fact, we've done some research. You can't actually find a single successful biotech company that did not have a foundational partnership that allowed them to be successful. It's really quite amazing, and it's an incredible aspect of the the need for synergies between these 2 parties. So anyway, I sometimes, because when I meet with people sometimes on this, it's sort of, again, you get this sort of nice to have on either side, and hey, this is a must have. Yet when you look at it, you sort of see, okay, what's driving some of those trends even more deeply? I think on the pharma side, there's just been an explosion of modalities. When I was at BMS, we had 2 modalities. We were a small molecule company, and we built ourselves into mAbs when I was there. This is in from 2004 to 2010. At that time, there was gene therapies had been tried and failed. Cell therapies were just emerging, and still it was all ex vivo. Still kind of a challenging business model, though an incredible therapeutic approach. Now you've got 12, 13, truly validated. As in these are things that have gone to the FDA and been approved and have products on the market. So you just, and the rate of, I would say, then innovation on even the standard modalities, whether it's new approaches to biologics, or whether it's even, newer ways to think about chemistry, plus, okay, all the nucleic acids, oligonucleotides, radiotherapies. You just go down the list. So it's impossible if you're a pharma company to imagine you could bring all of those ever inside. You just couldn't possibly make that investment to have all of those different modalities inside. And yet, if you don't then explore that, there's a huge amount of the druggable genome that you wouldn't be able to access. So, in the AI revolution, people are kind of up and down about this. There's no way to overhype this. Whether it's fits and starts, it's just a matter of when and the impact this is going to have, particularly in the standard modalities. So the traditional advantage of pharma companies was the know-how they had. A target got published in Cell or Nature or what have you, and people were following them and excited about that. Everybody rushes in, right? This is why you get these horse races. And then it was really the know-how, the applied know-how of pharma companies that kind of piled in and got the advantage, right? They would get their chemistry programs happening faster. They would get a map program. Well, today in an AI world, now we were just commenting on the side here before the panel started. I get these things from Chinese companies. I mean, literally every major target, they're like, hey, I've got an antibody, I've got a small molecule. I mean, it's incredible at low cost, high quality, what can be done. So that advantage, is really deteriorating. So then it also leads you to, hey, you got to think about new modalities just to have a competitive advantage, or you have to think about novel biology that's proprietary to you. So this acceleration in the external innovations is, even with the challenges in the funding market, is still just driving harder and harder. And you're going to need innovation to overcome a lot of the pricing challenges. I mean, the big headwinds that we're having here, like you're seeing it through the IRA, and it's an unfortunate construct of how it even treats the traditional modalities, is also pushing to that. On the other side, you look at the biopharma, there's ever increasing focus right now on assets. And not only not preclinical assets, but clinical assets. Whether you're a pharma company who desire that, or you're the investor base, particularly public investors, it's almost without that, you can't even access those capital things. And increasingly, then you're just down to a much smaller pot of, okay, to get preclinical or platforms funded, there's a smaller group of private investors who are also looking to say, okay, well, hey, I need an exit strategy here. And that exit strategy is either pharma or a public market. And if they're only looking for clinical assets, it's just putting an incredible drive to focus on assets. So, one of the things is, hey, there are pharma companies that are willing to work with you right earlier on a platform basis or preclinical assets. And so, again, I think the explosion of the novel technology is also making it very competitive, and the need for funding is then harder. Obviously, we're also the nature of these technologies is kind of driving us to need more funding. So you're seeing these Series A's and these Series B's as larger, partly because of what it takes to kind of get these technologies to be scaled and usable. And then, of course, as I think the commercial markets become even more and more complex, right, in terms of pricing environment, the need to work with a large company to do that, and certainly in the late stage development, it just becomes ever more clear. So I think you can see, all right, so we need each other, right? Pharma needs biotech clearly needs, yet, and I deal with this every day, yet the process that we come together to match make and contract, if that could just catch up with anything close to the innovation, it's incredible to me how uninnovative actually we in some ways have been in the BD space. And it's just, we did some analysis. Typically, from the time of express interest from a pharma company with a biotech company to an actual signed deal is typically around 2 years. 2 years. I mean, you can imagine that. The life in a biotech company of 2 years, that you're thinking this is happening and, will it happen, and all that time and effort in. And by the way, the probability of success is actually quite low, even in that process, So, part of that, hey, there's just so many inefficiencies. And then you get into the contracting process and the amount of haggling that goes over, and I think it's just inherent in just the negotiations or what the outcome is. And you look at the variability of the outcomes, right? If you actually took contracts and said, okay, from the time they started to the time they end versus what the market was, how much variation actually is there? It's actually pretty small. So you just find yourself why am I wasting a year of both time when I could actually have gotten the science started, negotiating these terms that, in the end, 9 times out of 10, they never get invoked anyway. And, don't really lead to differential value versus the value of getting the deal done itself. One of the things I say to all my teams is time kills all deals. Time kills all deals. Okay. So the longer the time goes, it's just, you should be worried. It's a little bit I remember when we were at BMS, we looked at, the number one predictor of failure was the time something was in phase 2. If you were beyond a year and a half in phase 2, it's because you didn't have a strong enough signal to suggest there was something to move on and you were struggling. It's a very similar dynamic, I think, within deals. Hey, if this thing is going on, once you have a term sheet and you're going beyond 6 months and you don't see a path to closure, you should be Danger Will Robinson. This is I'm in a tough spot. So the other thing is just there's a lot of things out there, right? I mean, people think that pharma companies are slow. They're not slow. They're just overwhelmed by choice. They just see so many things and trying to sort out, is this the right thing? Is that the right thing? That makes it, very challenging. So I think there's lots of reasons why, the process today, is challenging. And I think what we need to focus on is, hey, how can we actually get the BD contracting side of this, in line with the pace of innovation that's happening on the outside? And and then there are things that are happening, and we're trying to do some stuff at Flagship that I'll kind of tell you about, to try to see, hey, can we come up with a slightly different model? We have this concept called an innovation supply chain. So if you think about this, comes actually out of like the car industry. For years, the car companies, were the buyers, right? There are all these different suppliers for their cars, and they would just, do these short-term hammering contracts and stuff like that. And yet when they had to shift things like, hey, we need a different brake pad, or we need a different transmission, what have you, then the companies couldn't pivot fast enough, and they would get in. So they then said, you know what, this would be much better if we just made this much more predictable, right? Why don't we just have longer term relationships? We know you're going to come to us for these things. Like, why don't we just try to get together to make this, that the contracting cycles are shorter. We can agree about prices in advance. You can share with us the kind of innovation that you would like to see, and we can share back what we're thinking. And that kind of relationship that developed a lot of industrial factors, that's yet really to develop here. If you think about it, it's all completely serendipity. Biotech companies just say, hey, I think it's an interesting idea. I'm going to build it. And later on, I'll hope that something I come up with will be appealing to somebody somewhere in the pharma universe. Versus sitting down with pharma and saying, okay, what is it that you guys are looking for? What are the things we have? And also trying to have a dialogue so that they can see the art of the possible, right? Because sometimes they're just not aware of what could be done out there, and maybe that'll spark their thinking. And the flip side is then we can target bringing forward, I think, medicines that pharma is really going to want to have. So, I think there are things that we kind of need to kind of do in that space. Let me just tell you quickly just a bit about Flagship. Many of you might know us, but often when I talk to people about Flagship, people have a real misnomer. One is people think we're a venture capital company, and we're not. We use venture capital funding, but, essentially, if the traditional venture capital model in biotech is a group of investors, which are investors, by the way, go to academia, pull something out, try to verify that that's, legitimate, basically come up in a syndicate to try to then fund that and build a management team and advance that technology up to some inflection point, whether they're going to cycle out, in an IPO round, perhaps, or maybe keep going public or sell it to pharma. And the Flagship, we do something slightly different, not slightly, very different. One is we found our own IPs. We have our own scientists, and we're not pulling things necessarily out of academia. We come up with our own ideas of what we want to do. We often supplement it with academic work, but it's not essentially coming from theirs. And then we are the principal owners of these companies. So what we want to do is be an owner, not an investor in these companies. And so one of the things we don't syndicate. We're the primary owners in it. We bring other investors in, but they're not other people. They're essentially people that want to invest alongside with us, but not part of the boards. And so we try to advance these companies. And partly that's because our primary focus is to create platforms. And to us, a platform is a technology that can regularly and repeatably come up with high quality new medicines, at least in the therapeutic space. And we have non-therapeutic approaches as well. So we're really a company of companies, and we are owners of those companies. And the interesting thing about that, the way we think about this, which is, we really want to move beyond what we call adjacencies. So when I was at BMS, we had, tons of immune checkpoints. So we had CTLA-4, which was ipilimumab, and then we had PD-1, which became Opdivo. An adjacency to that had been, another checkpoint inhibitor, LAG-3 or, OX40, something that was very closely related that maybe could be combined. That to me is an adjacency of an innovation. Something that is a white space would be, hey, could I take, are there commensal viruses in the body that could be used as a viral vector? Now it's interesting about that. Nobody in academia actually studies commensal viruses because we're so interested in pathogens and all the funding comes to that piece. But yet when you go and look in the human body, it's actually quite interesting. There's actually thousands of viruses that coexist with us, just like we have, thousands, if not millions of bacteria that do the same thing. And yet there's like literally no research in this. Very, very little. So we had a team that said, hey, that's really interesting because if you had a commensal virus, right, it would be immune silent, right? It's commensal, so it exists in the body. It's not being picked up by the immune system. That would be a huge advantage versus AAV and these other viral-based vectors to deliver gene therapies. Or, at the same time, then you could redose it. Two huge issues, and it could have tropism. These viruses actually exist in different organs and are specified to those organs. So I bring that up as one example. It's a company called Ring now. That was the kind of question that we asked, that's, just kind of out there. There's not any academic research in, but it's one of these ideas, which is, hey, if we did that, do we think there would be any value to it? And that's sort of our, essential approach. One interesting aspect of this, which is we think about innovation based upon the concept of really what occurs in nature, right? If you look at natural selection, you don't have an upfront controlled set of innovations, right? Mutations are just random. But then you apply natural selection, right? That determines whether that mutation will actually survive. In a similar way, we're trying to do the same thing. We don't actually say, okay, well, we're going to do, explorations in this particular area. We just allow young scientists to think of ideas, interesting what if questions that, and then we apply natural selection to it by putting selective pressure to say, okay, that's interesting. Is it even feasible? What are all the reasons not to do that? And, it's easy to ask experts that. They'll tell you all the reasons not to do these things. And then we say, well, we can overcome and answer some of these questions. And if it can survive that pressure, kind of flip ahead, that's what allows us to kind of move companies forward. So we do these explorations. They're literally whiteboard type explorations. They're paper, so to speak, quote unquote, in a digital era. And then we do protocols, which is just a $2 million investment to say, hey, is there a there? Let's actually generate some data to see if this hypothesis works with the explicit intention of you want to try to kill it, right? Because that's the whole point of natural selection. You want to put as much pressure on as you can so that the things that are robust emerge. That creates us a new co that's 100% Flagship owned and run entity. And then over time, what happens is we see that the platform gets some robustness and we're ready to start thinking about product development on that platform. And then we bring in CEOs to run those companies and some independence to the board. And then ultimately, we often remain the principal owners of these things. I'm going to just kind of skip over this. But one of the things we tried to do in pioneering medicines was, so we recognize, hey, we're doing a great job of building these very innovative platforms. We're probably not doing as great a job as we could in terms of coming up with incredible medicines off of those platforms. COVID aside and Moderna, which is obviously an amazing story, we were looking historically saying, hey, we could probably do a better job because a lot of times the product development on a platform early on is actually to validate the platform. And maybe a secondary consideration is, does that product actually have independent value to it? I mean, it has value, but and so part of the thought was okay, what we need to help our management teams be able to do, they have to have a certain amount of focus and get started. These platforms can be hugely broadly applied. We need parallel efforts on those platforms. We need to make it easy to basically do an incremental program on our platforms. How could we do that? And initially, when I was at BMS, Flagship came to me and my R&D colleagues and said, well, why doesn't pharma do that? And of course, pharma's like, hey, these technologies are very interesting, but they're way out there and they're unvalidated and, we'll wait. And we said, okay, well, let's establish our own unit and basically put together this group called Pioneering Medicines, which was to create a drug development capability with inside Flagship, which we can do as part of our ecosystem because of the ownership model that I described earlier. It would make sense for us to put infrastructure above our companies that we could deploy to our companies. That wouldn't make sense in a VC type environment where you're in with various other players and all the time shifting into different companies. So that's what we've done to try to think. And we have our team actually look across all the technologies and think independently of here's a program that we would deploy. We do integrated teams with our bioplatform companies to come together saying, hey, we think this is an interesting idea. And typically we're trying to do it in an area that you wouldn't naturally go into. Like oncology, rare disease is often where a lot of our platforms go because it's where you can get to patients faster, big unmet medical needs, and very feasible from a development perspective. We want to work in areas like cardiovascular and metabolics and things that are much harder that often then require a partner, not just us, but beyond us. And that's the other piece that we've done. Is to work with external collaborators. And a little bit of this is what I wanted to talk to you about today in terms of innovation, which is trying to think about how could we be more innovative in how this works, right? So one of the things we try to do with our companies is, okay, we have central BD people that are more experienced than you can either afford or would make sense to have in a small company so that they could support the companies. That's this kind of far left. The other piece to this, which is this idea of this innovation supply chain. So one of the things we've done as Flagship is actually we started with Novo Nordisk. We've done this with Pfizer, just recently with GSK, and said to them, hey, why don't we set up an umbrella contract? You work with Flagship, and what we'll do is co-conceive of what types of new programs you'd like to develop. What are the problems you're trying to solve? Give us a target profile of something that you can't do today. either because you don't see the technology externally or because you don't have it in-house. And we'll basically partner with you to say, okay, here's all the ways in which our technology perhaps could solve that problem. Then we will go to, and we've established a sort of an IP framework and a way to collaborate, kind of pre-collaborate, if you will, to kind of remove a lot of the friction. So we pre-negotiated, for example, all the economics. We've come up with templates of contracts. We said, hey, once we decide on this and we bring our bioplatform company in, what we want to do is have a high degree of certainty that they're going to get this and that, we can get this contract down in 6 months. That would be the ideal versus the 2 years and the very low hit rate. And on the value side, to make sure that we've got something that is at least close to market. There's a trade-off there. It's a trade-off for the pharma company because in some cases they may feel like they're overpaying. There's a trade-off to our bioplatforms because they're like, hey, I maybe could have gotten something higher. But as I was saying before, when you have a platform that can do multiple things, you just want to get as many things done as you can. And so just taking, I think, reasonable economics in a very short period of time to get it done and just get that, then you can move on to the next program and have a very broad portfolio is what we think is going to lead to success. And so, I think this is one example of like trying to think about, hey, how is it that we can try to take out a lot of the friction that exists within this kind of partnering space, and trying to create, kind of a longer term, more predictable, hey, we understand your needs. We'll help you translate, what our technologies could do, bring people to the table and put it in a BD framework that we think just makes it easier for everybody to get this done. And, it's starting to get a lot of traction. I think it's a better way to try to handle something that are highly innovative like our platforms. Because again, it's very difficult to go out and talk to pharma companies and really convince them to even engage on this versus you have a more kind of informal dialogue saying, hey, I'm not trying to advocate for any one thing. I'm just saying based on what you're telling me that I maybe have one or two things that could work within a broad ecosystem. And, and I would imagine that others will try to see, could you come up with something like that? So anyway, I just want to share some of those thoughts and observations. And I think Robert and I, with Rafi's help, we'll take some questions. Yes, do you want to take just questions right now, or do you want to have Robert? Yeah. All right, Robert.
Yeah. Hey, maybe I can ask the first question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Paul. So, when you were at BMS, for example, you made the comment that the 50% internal, 50% external. You have to be careful of the not invented here syndrome type of approach from the R&D organization. But what kind of data were you looking for before you could say, okay, this is a BD opportunity in the early stage, not clinical stage data, but in the early, when you maybe have a preclinical type of asset? How did you view that? What were you looking for?
Well, I think typically there were kind of three things that we were looking for. One, probably the most important thing is alignment on the biology, right? That this was a target of interest that we really thought was worth going after. And that could either be, hey, we had a supposition that was the case and wanted the help of a biotech to help us kind of, confirm that or validate that. Or it could be like, hey, we already had a lot of conviction around a particular target and we were just looking for the right way to drug it. So that I think is probably number one. And as the BD lead, it was great when the R&D team was like, this is a target that we absolutely want to get, something to. It actually made the job on our side a lot simpler. Then if I flip over to the modality side of it, I think, you wanted to see, I think a couple things. One is some initial data to say, that this was highly feasible that you could drug this target with this approach. To the extent that people also had, I think, initial starting molecular matter to advance on that both had accounting benefits of that, but obviously, that much farther down the line. And then the other thing was just the team itself. Just hey, what's the track record of the team? What's the stability of the company? And what's the chemistry in terms of working together? So those are often a lot of the things that I think we look for to say, hey, this is a good opportunity. And like I said, often it's difficult because there's lots of choices, right? But I think coming in, and being I think, highly prepared and practicing really kind of, particularly if you can get some friends and family to help you kind of test your pitch before you go in, is helpful. Because it's, as I was doing this with my own team. So at Pioneer Medicines, we actually have a whole, portfolio of about 15 programs. And we were thinking ourselves about going out. And even I fell into this trap. And, we had put together a presentation. I had reviewed it. But when you're close to something, it's amazing what you miss.
Yeah.
So we have an outside advisory board that, is several folks from large pharma companies. And, it's just amazing their feedback. I mean, and I've done this a lot, right? And I'm like, I can't believe I fell for that rookie mistake. So, but it just shows you like, it's hard to be objective about something you're very close to. So,
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I was curious if your approach to bioplatform partnerships changes when you're talking about cardiovascular disease and metabolics as opposed to oncology and rare diseases.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally no, honestly. Many things I just mentioned, I think still reign true. But some of what's a little bit different about it is often, I think, on the translational side, because not so much of those therapeutic areas are done in the kind of biotech space. There may not be much as experience with it. Often having more of a dialogue with a pharma company, like for example, like, hey, what would be the right model? What is the right assay? How would you think about trying to do some translation here? Is probably more there's probably more dialogue around that, and just understanding kind of what the requirements are in that space. Then there's just the nature of the deal itself is probably very different because you really will need the pharma company to come in earlier into it because in an oncology space or, in a rare disease space, you as the biotech could probably run those trials and actually even the proof of concept trials in humans. That's probably prohibitively expensive, like in heart failure,
Yes.
Or in, even in, weight loss. Now, some of those things like weight loss is an interesting one, which is actually there's some simplicity to a lot of those fields. Like they're probably not as clinically complex. So like oncology and rare disease is much more clinically complex in terms of what you have to measure and all that, versus there's some very simple biomarkers like, weight loss and, muscle retention, or the cardiovascular markers that are measured every day, right? And just standard clinical care. So in some ways, while the size of the trials is very large, the complexity of the trials is often less.
How would you view neurosciences?
Yeah, neuroscience is interesting. I mean, it definitely feels like one of those areas that, I think if you look at the history of the industry relative to metabolism and weight loss, right? Everybody got out.
Yep.
And yet, when you introduce, it was interesting because there were therapies out there that were getting less than 10% weight loss before the GLP-1s. But it was just when you got to about 15%, boom. Just a massive explosion, and probably the biggest pharmaceutical market that will ever exist. It's just kind of amazing kind of sticking with it. So I flip over to think about that. We as an industry have done in the biotech space, I think have gone after a lot of neurodegenerative approaches because I think the biology seems tractable and obviously the unmet need is enormous. But when you think about the other spaces like the psychiatric diseases, it was great to see the Karuna approval come through. I think, one, just knowing people that either suffer from these mental illnesses, just even in my own family, people with depression. The therapies out there are they're just not very good.
Suboptimal.
Yeah, they're really suboptimal. So, it would be, I think it's a huge unmet need. And, I think the perseverance to stay in it, but I think it's gated by the biology, but that being said, I think with an AI world, I think a lot of interesting approaches to novel targets that are out there. It feels like a place that is on the cusp of something happening. And we've even having a discussion in Flagship, should we do kind of like a Manhattan Project around this? Like, what could we do to try to unlock this, to more accelerate, what are the factors that we need? And in it, everything from, hey, how do you deal with like the placebo rate problems and the clinical development problems? Could we think innovatively about solving for that? And then, to lower the barrier there, could we come up with novel targets and have much more confidence? Could we just invest and and really understanding what are the best translational models. So, things like that you might say, hey, could go, because if you could open up that space, I think it would equally be as large as what you're seeing in the metabolic space.
Roger Matthews, I'm an analyst at Axiom here. Thanks so much for speaking with us. I was curious, so it sounds like one of the amazing things that Flagship is doing is really standardizing steps in the process. You mentioned standardizing the economics of these partnerships, as well as standardizing the innovation process. Do you have a method for standardizing when to pull the plug on ideas? And in the graphic you showed, of course, there's many more X's than there are arrows going forward. Do you have a standardized way to say, okay, we've pursued this up to this point and it's ready, this is not going to go past?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we try, but it's probably one of the most difficult things. One of the things, and it's funny, I was just reflecting on this. I had this external advisory board, and one of the things I was mentioning was, I said, one of the advantages that we have, which is, we don't have any metrics for advancement. So if you're a small biotech company and you have an asset, there's a stickiness to it, right? Which is you're like, okay, well, I need something because I got to raise money and I got to show that I have assets. And so there's just an inherent stickiness to saying, hey, you just can't kill these things arbitrarily. You got to really think. And so, and then there's the inherent stickiness of teams that are working on those things and they attach their careers to them and their, all their efforts over these years. So there's just natural kind of what people call progression seeking, that's inherent in both the management team, the teams, and the business strategy of small companies. And it's just as bad in large companies. They also, if you're the head of R&D, at some point you have to show productivity. And, volume is one of those metrics. Now, you would hope that would be commensurate with quality. But at some level, you got to just say, hey, I got to put something into and show that I actually have a pipeline. One of the things I think we have both on the company creation side, that pipeline, and in a product creation side, I don't just have any of those constraints. I'm not trying to hit some sort of arbitrary goal for a portfolio. So I can simply say, hey, is this a good idea to keep going? Or should I just kill this now? Because one nice thing about both a platform where the platform itself could have a myriad of opportunities. I shouldn't be married to any one thing because I can very quickly think about bringing something else forward. And particularly at Flagship, on a meta side above company, that we can try to say, hey, how could we do that and make that more, faster for you so that you don't feel like you have to stick with these things. So it's a long-winded answer of it's, I think, the core problem, that we all face. And I think we're trying to think structurally, could we solve for that? Because it's very hard to come up with just, it's ultimately judgment if you're going to not advance something or not.
But I think the other piece is just a competitive environment and understanding the biology.
Yeah.
And if you can't figure out the biology, how much more risk do you want to continue to put behind this? I mean, so it's a very complex. It's a very good question, but a very complex answer.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. And actually, the competitive thing is really, it's actually super challenging, right? Because on the one hand, you don't want to get so overwhelmed with competitors, right? Particularly those that are kind of at a similar stage to you, which is it's very clear if there's any winners or anything. So you don't want to sort of sit in there and say, oh God, I can never compete in this space. On the other hand, it's hard if you're going into a space where there are so many other options, particularly because it actually kind of paralyzes investors and pharma companies. If you look at what's happening in the nucleic acid space, because all the delivery is hepatic, all the disease targets that people are going after are the same disease targets, right? High on medical need and these kind of liver associated diseases, and so there's a million approaches to them, right? Because there's all these really exciting modalities. And, and that's hard, right? Because people just sit there and say, oh, shoot, I can't sort this out. I'll just let the data sort itself out. And so they hold back. So, that's one downside to it, I think, of trying, even if you probably have a very good opportunity and all the reasons to stick with it, there's just some natural challenges to convincing others that need to give you money, essentially, to invest in this thing before, because they can't sort it out.
Right.
Yeah. I'm curious what the response has been like from the platform companies. On one hand, like I imagine being a CEO and you have now access not only to a faster deal, but potentially a deal you would never have even done, but also, to the extent these platform companies have CBOs that want to be the hero. And I'm just kind of curious how that's played out.
No, it's a very good observation. And it's funny because Michelle Werner's in the audience with me and she's one of our CEOs. And so I should hand it over to her to give the honest answer. But I think this is kind of the dynamic, which is I think that many of the dynamics are right and rightfully so, right? Which is, hey, you're, ultimately, and this is even our objective at Flagship. At the end of the day, what we would love to see is every one of our our biotech platform companies have a pharma relationship, at least one. And, and ideally a deep one, right? Multiple targets that we're trying to advance together. So that would be ideal. The data is challenging, right? I'll tell you, there's 5 to 6 of those deals done a year in the entire sector, like all pharma companies, all biotech companies. So to be honest with you, if we get one within the ecosystem of our 40 plus companies, we should all be high-fiving each other. Like that was great. We got one of the 5 to do those. So that's the reality. But that means that hey, you have to keep trying for that. What we try to do is to the extent that we can, and this is not easy, which is to make sure that we really are acting as one team, and allowing, because what we're often trying to do is how we, if you will, kind of some of the convincing points to do this type of deal with the pharma companies to say, okay, I get it. You don't want to do a 5 to 8 target deal on any one technology. So why don't we do the equivalent across multiple technologies? But we say, okay, the economics are we're only going to give you access to very thin slices, which they always push back on. They want more access, and they want it for the same economics as one thing. But that's fair for them to push on that. But what we're hoping is hey, that kind of one-step deal leads to the bigger deal. That once they get more familiar and they get more comfortable with the technology, they'll kind of come in on that. But we're getting better at this. I think we're trying hard to say, hey, how can we just work as a team and and as much as possible, try to make sure that the platform is heavily involved in the dialogue and they get the exposure, not just of the science, but of the team itself. And so that they can build the trust and the relationship. And ultimately, as Flagship, we could pull back and then that goes on. But it's a very good observation of how these things work.
So Paul, I want to ask you a question that maybe back on your pharma days versus your Flagship days. Because Flagship is a unique model, and maybe there's 1 or 2 other companies similar to that, but it's unique. There's a lot of people in here have singular biotech companies that are not part of a larger organization. And you mentioned it takes 2 years actually to get a deal done. For many companies, 2 years is about how much cash they have in the bank, right? Maybe.
Yeah.
Most
actually, if you have 2 years cash, good for you.
Yeah. I was going to say most companies have less than 18 months. Many less than saw a stat less than 12 months. So what advice would you have, from a pharma standpoint on how should a biotech engage with a big pharma company or a series of companies when it takes that long, knowing that you're running out of cash, maybe you're not able to raise money because of, what you don't yet at the right level to be able to raise money from your next pivot point. What advice would you have for a company like that?
Yeah, it's a challenge, right, for sure. And I think part of it is, probably this is not going to be surprising to you. Actually, a great way to think about it is probably how you should be treating your investors, which is just, kind of constant kind of dialogue and interaction. Even if you're not sure yet, right, that there's a deal there, right? If you have an asset perhaps to talk to them about or, that they're ripe for the table, which is just establishing those connections and using every opportunity to do that because they take a while. Typically a platform deal is, almost universally done because the head of R&D or the head of research there wants to do it. And because it's too risky for even somebody underneath them. Somebody might champion and say, hey, I think this is a really interesting approach, but it's a very risky thing to do a platform deal. So, you have to eventually get your way up. Typically there's one, that one person below, typically maybe the head of biology, or if it's some modality, maybe the modality lead in that space that they have, can help you and be that champion. I'll say this, the business development people and having run the business development group, the S&E people really, they can't help you that much, to be honest with you. They can kind of flag an interesting opportunity. They're very good when you have an asset that the company's very interested in, and they will doggedly come to you. But I think in selling a platform deal, kind of the S&E teams and the BD teams, which are the easiest to get to, are probably not the right people. So thinking about a strategy of how you're going to build a relationship with these kind of key people in the pharma companies. Just like you think about courting future investors, not your current investors, but future investors. You almost have to have the same strategy. And as Michelle can attest, or any CEO, you guys, you did it, and Alan, I'm seeing you. It's hard. It's hard. How do you parse your time? You could say the CEO is really the chief external officer. The one person that has to be out there constantly talking to investors and talking to pharma, and that probably is the right allocation. But somebody's got to run the company too. Yeah. So it's not an easy balance. And and this is also where you should construct your board and really put it on your board. They should be out there doing this, because many of us as board members have much better connections. And should be really out there, advocating for you and getting you those introductions, and even more so, developing the relationships.
I think you touched on a really important point. You have to have the right champion at the right level.
Yeah.
And those relationships, if you don't have them, it takes time to build, or you have to have the right board to help give you the access to that type of, to accelerate that.
How have you thought about that balance? How did that external versus internal facing aspects when you're running something?
Well, obviously you always want to have a great management team that can help you run the internal piece of this, right? Yeah. But between yourself, your CBO, and your CSO, those external facing components, especially your chief scientific officer or chief medical officer, depending on how your company's set up, so critical of getting those relationships at the pharma level, and in the deals themselves. I had, coming from big pharma, I had one of the big pharma guys goes, you know what? He goes, I hear these pitches 20 times a week. And it's like the next, you have the next best thing since sliced bread. I hear that from everybody. I have no clue if any of this stuff is going to work. And so part of this is understanding what their needs are, what their strategies are, and does your technology actually fit into their strategy or an adjacent to their strategy? Because if it doesn't, you're probably wasting a lot of time.
Yeah.
So understanding those companies' strategies, and does your technology actually can help them achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve, I think you have a much better a way to actually package your whatever it is that you have, package it up to fulfill. It's very similar to it's like selling to some degree. Because it's what you're doing, but it's got to be driven by the science. It's got to be rooted in the science, but it has to be rooted in such a way that fits into their strategy. And so that takes a lot of time and effort to understand that company's strategy, understand who the key decision makers are, and getting, and you're right about the BD folks, they can get excited about it, but without having the right scientists in the room, depending on where your drug is in development platform, it's never going to go anywhere, and you just beat your head up against the wall, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah. One thing I've always been impressed on, which was a good way to think about it, is actually how consulting firms sell business within pharma company or any big company. Right. And, a lot of times, and you see this with the senior partners at a BCG or McKinsey or any of the big firms. And, they often just walk the halls with no agenda, right? When I was at BMS, they would often, you had the same meetings that I did, with the same person. And, they would come in and sit in your office, and they just listen. They're like therapists, and because they're really trying to hear what is on your mind. Right. So that they can then when you sit there and say, my problem is this is what's kind of really I'm struggling with right now. And they're like, and they come back, well, that's interesting. We might have an approach to help you with that. And I think you have to think about it the same way. It's very difficult to quote unquote sell a platform, because one, scientists are inherently skeptical, and beyond the natural, anti-consumer piece in all of us, which is all right, somebody's selling something to me, so I don't trust it. But if you can get it to be more of hey, if they would think about, I remember talking to Michelle, and she told me about this tRNA platform, and I wonder if that could be our solution. Let me, and if somebody reaches out to you, now that's very rare, but even if it's just on their mind, so that, or you get that insight into, hey, there's, a way in which this platform could really help me, that's where you're going to have success. Or when somebody, you have something where, you're working on a target when they're like, hey, we've now gotten a lot of conviction around that target, and then the pharma companies, like I said, really want to come out.
But I think your point, nobody likes to be sold too much stuff, right? Because there's an inherent, but people like to buy. If you have the right opportunity to fix the problem that they have, right? So so I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing you should remember, which is, And it's hard as a little company. Like big companies have FOMO big time. I mean, they really do. They really worry about missing out on the big thing. So, it oftentimes I think we get worried about like, oh my God, they just, why would they even bother listening to me? But, they really don't want to miss out on the big thing. So, I think you should take advantage of that, and engaging some interest scientifically, I think is key.
Last question.
Go ahead. So I want to get your opinion on how, when thinking through pipeline development and picking between a bunch of different assets, how do you determine picking between an asset that has great unmet need, but maybe not a great NPV, and assets that aren't addressing a huge unmet need, but maybe can help you hit a target IRR, have a great NPV?
Yeah, I mean, I think, typically, honestly, in the early space, probably some of those metrics, honestly, are not even very helpful at some level. Now, you have to do some amount of like, hey, we only have so much money to invest, and what are the best things to invest in? So along those lines, we do have a lot of these discussions. I think a lot of it is really coming in more down to, hey, what is unique about my technology that could really unlock that biology? And focusing on that. I mean, I think you do want to, get this balance. And this is a tough one. We often talk about this to the degree that we don't want to take biology risk, i.e., and go after something that has some amount of validation. Now maybe it's not pure clinical validation. Somebody's shown in a clinical trial that it works, but, strong translational validation, or, increasingly now genetic validation, which helps a lot, whether there's natural human knockouts of that target, or, GWAS analysis that would suggest that that's a really good thing to go after. But you need some tension in that, because I do think oftentimes I see, if you go after some, when I first came into Flagship, there were so many discussions around, well, we could do this with PD-1. And I was like, guys, the world does not need another PD-1, even if you could just exquisitely target it. And I'm not just saying that because we had one, there's like 25 of there. And so, I think it's, not going that far, like, hey, you really need to think about something that looks promising, and maybe not be 100%, validated, but more importantly, that like, hey, your technology could really kind of go after. It's a very high bar if you're going to go after a very known mechanism, like say like TNF or IL-6, or I'm thinking of a bunch of the immuno targets, unless you just have it's just such a hard thing of differentiation that you kind of, even though it might be a fantastic experiment to show you how your platform works, it's going to be so heavily discounted because the target is so not interesting.
Yeah.
That I think that's, you're going to have to take some risk. And, that's kind of the judgment call.
I mean, you saw that in the cell therapy space with all the CD19s, right? Nobody wanted to invest in another CD19.
I guess the lesson learned is that the world does not need another PD-1. We have established that. And time kills a good deal. That's always good to hear. Paul has graciously wanted to stay for lunch, so we can catch up with you one-on-one as well. And thank you for coming in. This is
thanks, Aviz. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Robert. Great to see you.